Hello, my dear dreamers. It is Emma here, and you have arrived once again at Sleeping Therapy by Emma. This is the little corner of the night where stories are not told in haste or noise, but in whispers that roll slowly like waves against the shore. My voice is your lantern in the dark, swaying softly to guide you, helping the busy thoughts of the day loosen and drift like small boats untied from the pier. Every night we take a journey together, and tonight I have chosen for you an adventure that sounds fierce by name, but will unfold in a way that soothes you, even as it paints pictures of danger and the sea. You see, pirates have long captured the imagination, rough men and women with ragged sails, toughened skin, and eyes sharp from searching endless horizons. They are often celebrated as wild flames of freedom, but oh, the truth behind their lives was far from comfortable. Their days were not full of treasure chests and joyous songs. Instead, they scraped through hunger, storms, sickness, and peril. Tonight's story is called The Horrible Life of Pirates You Wouldn't Survive, but do not worry. This tale will not throw you into chaos. My telling will drift at a gentle pace, like a ship rocking on calm waters. The harshness of pirate life will be softened in the folds of storytelling, as though you are listening from the safety of a warm bed, while I turn these rough truths into rhythm and atmosphere. You will hear of endless oceans, of creaking wooden decks, of salt that clings to skin and refuses to wash away. You will hear of men and women who chased after impossible freedom and often found themselves in misery. But as you listen, each description will carry you deeper into your own calm sea of dreams, where you are only an observer, never in danger. So come with me as we sail into the past, into lives that once were hard and grim, so that your present, that soft pillow, that blanket around you, feels all the sweeter. This is not just a story. It is a lullaby of history, a reminder that comfort is precious and that safety, peace, and sleep are treasures far greater than pirate gold. The night was heavy with the scent of salt and wood tar. The ocean, endless and unbroken, spread in every direction, a shifting plain of dark glass. Out there, somewhere, a ship drifted slowly, its sails patched with mismatched cloth, its timbers groaning like an old man forced to walk farther than his bones liked. That ship was no jewel of an empire, nor a polished war vessel. It was a pirate ship, though not the shining fantasy people so often imagine when they speak of pirate legends. No, this ship was ugly with wear, scarred along its sides from failed battles, and streaked with the black stains of old fires. It was called the Bitter End. Now, my dear dreamer, let me invite you aboard, not as a sailor, but as a quiet guest, a shadow among shadows, unseen, safe, and distant, only listening as I tell you what happens here. The crew of the Bitter End were not the laughing rogues of ballads. They were thin, their skin hardened by sun and salt wind, their ribs showing against ragged shirts. Some had sores along their legs from scurvy, that quiet thief of sailors who stole their strength by denying them fruit or greens. Water was rationed, every drop stored in barrels that tasted sour, mixing with the stench of mildew. Every morning, before the sky bled with sunrise, The men and a few women rolled out of hammocks strung low in the belly of the ship. Imagine it, if you can. The air thick and damp, packed with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke-soaked fabric, and brine. The hammocks swayed against each other as people climbed down, boots or bare feet, thumping against wooden boards, sticky with spilled stew and worse. A cough here, a groan there, the muttering of curses at another day alive. It is strange, is it not, to think that for them, survival itself was almost a complaint. Long nights had taught them that tomorrow never promised treasure, but only more waiting, more hardship. Above deck, the sea was their prison and their open road, both at once. The bitter end creaked as it rocked, sails struggling to catch half-hearted winds. Ropes were tightened, scraped hands burned against rough hemp. A boy no older than 14 hauled a line alongside men whose faces were carved with years of storms. Sweat fell. Voices barked. And the sun rose to beat down mercilessly on salt-burned skin. These sailors, these pirates, had turned from life on land for reasons as varied as the stars. One had been a farmer broken by debts. Another had fled from a prison. A woman named Eliza, her hair ragged and eyes like sea glass, had once sold fish in a harbor town until hunger and cruelty drove her aboard. There was no poster child of pirate life here, only the desperate and the broken, pieced together into a crew. And though they once thought of treasure, gold, and jewels, what kept them alive was not dreams of riches, but the immediate need for bread, water, and a scrap of peace. Life aboard moved in rhythms, harsh and relentless. The cook, a thin man missing 3 teeth, boiled salted pork that smelled half-rotten but would keep them alive. Biscuit hard as stone was served, often crawling with weevils. Pirates would hold the biscuit over the fire until the bugs fell out, then gnaw the rest. You can almost hear the crunch, can't you? Not very glorious. Yet amid the misery, they found ways to survive not just in body but in spirit. Someone might hum an old tune under their breath at night, the kind of tune mothers once sang over cradles. Another might carve a piece of driftwood into a shape resembling something they had lost: a dog, a home, a beloved face. On deck in the evenings, after the long toil of patching sails or scrubbing decks, they sat together. The horizon yawned wide, the colors of dying sunlight spilling gold and purple across the sky. Their faces, worn and weary, softened in those moments. For though they were feared as cutthroats and criminals, here they were revealed simply as humans, fragile, longing, and endlessly tired. Captain Bartholomew, a tall man with one pale eye, would sit apart but listening. His voice, when it finally came, rumbled low as distant thunder. He reminded the crew of their next target, a fat merchant ship rumored to cross their course in weeks. He painted it with words: a floating pantry of goods, barrels of fruit, casks of fresh water, and perhaps coins. His words were not poetry, but survival bait. The thought of citrus was enough to stop the bleeding gums their sickness brought, and so hope was strung across them like another sail, the cloth thin, but enough to catch the wind. Nights stretched long and heavy with rocking seas. The moon cast its silver light over the waves, glimmering like spilled coins across the dark water. In those hours, the creak of ship and the sigh of waves was punctuated by whispers of dreams. A pirate named Jonah confessed one night that what he most longed for was not treasure, but simply to lie on grass again, to hear the chirping of crickets instead of gulls. Others nodded silently, each holding their own secret small longing. But in their silence, the truth of pirate life lived. This was less a choice, more an exile. They had given up homes, safety, comfort, and replaced it with hunger, disease, and violence, always prowling close. Still the ship wandered, horizon after horizon, water unbroken. The crew waited, patient yet restless, eyes always squinting at distant sails. Days stretched into weeks with no prize in sight. The food spoiled further, the water soured more, tempers sharpened like knives unsheathed. Fights broke out. One morning, a pirate named Briggs struck another with the butt of his musket for stealing a scrap of pork. He was beaten in return until both collapsed, wheezing. Captain Bartholomew, distant but watching, let them wear themselves thin before commanding silence. His authority was not screamed. It was carved into his presence. And when he stepped close, people lowered their eyes, knowing rebellion against him would end only in wait at the bottom of the sea. Yet even as he marched a weary crew forward, one could see it in his own ruined face. He too was trapped, commander of misery, chained to survival just as tightly as the rest. The sea can strip away illusions, my dear dreamer. And as you listen now, calmly resting, know that the lives of these pirates were not the grand tales of plays and paintings, but a suffering shuffled forward day by day, inch by inch, for the faintest promise of relief. And still, the first storm had not yet come. The ocean is a patient teacher, though her lessons are rarely kind. The first hardship she gives is monotony, an endless parade of days that look the same. Sky, water, salted air. No church bells, no town square, no clocks to chime the hours. Only the rising and falling of the sun, the pull of the tide, and the routines carved into human muscle. For the pirates on the bitter end, monotony was not peace. It was a gnawing hunger that slowly devoured the mind. They searched the horizon with restless eyes, desperate for a change of luck. Some prayed for fortune, for storms, for anything to break the sameness. And then, one day, fortune answered, though not kindly. It began with the wind. A cool breath rising where once the air had been still. Sails snapped sharply, catching more speed. The ship leaned, cutting through water with new energy. At first, the crew cheered. The ocean had grown bored of idleness, they thought, and sent them forward at last. The bow carved foaming arcs, the ropes hissed against pulleys, and the bitter taste of waiting lifted. But hope at sea, like clouds, can darken quickly. By nightfall, the wind had strengthened to a howl. Waves reared under the ship like wild horses, each one shoving the vessel higher, then slamming it down with bone-rattling force. The timbers groaned, seams widened, water spat through cracks in the deck. Storm. Captain Bartholomew barked, and in that single word lay everything: terror, command, inevitability. The deck became chaos. Sailcloths struggled, whipping loose. Pirates swarmed up rigging like frantic insects, tying knots with hands already shredded by salt and rope. Lightning split the sky-long cracks of white jagged light that lit faces pale as ghosts. For seconds at a time, the sea looked like shattered glass, glowing, roaring. Below deck, the boy Jonah clung to a beam, eyes wide. Around him, hammocks swung wild, pots clattered, men prayed in broken mutters. Each crash of water against the hull sent sprays through the cracks, drenching hair, clothes, and skin until everyone aboard was soaked with ocean and fear alike. Let me pause here, dear dreamer. Imagine the sound thunder and crashing waves, men shouting hoarsely through rain, wood shrieking under strain. And you, warm in bed, are only listening, safe on the shore of sound. For you, it is a lullaby of distant chaos. But for them, it was survival's edge. On deck, a rope snapped and whipped through the air. A man screamed as it tore across his shoulder, flinging him against the mast. Another slipped on the rain-slick planks and vanished overboard before a hand could seize him. His cry was swallowed, instantly gone, like he had never existed. No one stopped. There was no pausing to mourn amidst a storm. The living clung harder, the dead became part of the ocean. That was pirate life loss woven into the fabric of every voyage. Hours stretched as eternities in the storm's grip. But every storm has a heart, and once the ship had been tossed long enough, the violence began to ebb, like rage spent. Waves shrunk from mountains to hills, from hills back to restless ripples. The wind stuttered, then quieted, leaving only a rain that whispered instead of screamed. And then silence. The survivors slouched where they stood, some trembling uncontrollably, all drenched to the bone. 2 men had been lost overboard. One mast was broken halfway, dangling like a snapped limb. Water sloshed in puddles across the decks, carrying ruined biscuits, broken plates, and blood diluted by salt water. Captain Bartholomew stood steady in the wreckage, his pale eye gleaming faintly in the moonlight that now dared to show itself. He said only one thing: we patch, we live, and we sail. No one argued. No one dared. For nights afterward, the crew patched sails with whatever cloth they could harvest, even shirts ripped from their own backs. They baled water, hammered nails, and bound beams until the ship, though uglier than before, floated forward once again. And in that work grew a kind of bond. Pirates did not trust easily. Betrayal was a common tongue among them. Yet when death had stormed the decks and spared a few, those few found themselves tied together by threads, invisible threads of survival. They carried those threads forward into song, into story, into brief bursts of laughter when the seas grew calm again. Elisa, the fishmonger turned pirate, began to share tales from her village by the shore. She spoke of Gauls that stole bread from market stalls, and the old man who had cursed at them by chasing after them with a broom. The crew laughed, not because the tale was truly hilarious, but because laughter itself was treasure rare. Briggs, still nursing a broken rib from a fight, and still bruised from the storm, listened quietly. When he finally spoke, He confessed he once had a baby sister back on land. She would be grown now, a woman he'd never see again. Words fell quiet after that, the sea murmuring to fill the silence. It was in those shared fragments of humanity that the truth of piracy flickered most clearly. These were not men and women feasting on endless treasure, but people clinging desperately to survival, trying to remind themselves they were still human, even as the ocean threatened to grind them into nameless salt. And yet survival brings new hungers. Weeks passed. The supplies dwindled. Salt pork stank worse than rot. Water grew slimy in the barrels. Biscuits softened with mold. Hunger sharpened eyes toward the horizon once more. They whispered at night of merchant sails, of Spanish galleons, of ships fat with supplies. Each morning, Captain Bartholomew scanned the waters with his pale, unblinking gaze. Each night, frustration darkened his brow. No ships. Only emptiness, vast and eternal. Then, one red dawn, a cry rang out hoarse but electric. Sail! Sail on the horizon! Every pirate scrambled like sparks to the deck. They squinted at the faint line against the glow of sunrise, a shape cutting against sky and sea, larger, slower, merchant, surely merchant. Hunger became excitement, excitement became frenzy. Fingers clutched weapons, muscles tensed with old violence. The bitter ends ruined sails swelled as wind answered their desperate prayers. And slowly, like a tired predator, the pirate ship angled itself toward its prey. Section 2. The Empty Prize. Approximately 2,400 words. The horizon was aflame with dawn when the cry went up. The bitter end had waited through weeks of hunger, sickness, and monotony, but now sail. Each pirate felt his or her bones stir with new life. Exhaustion fled, replaced by an energy twined of desperation and greed. They gathered along the rails like starving wolves who had scented blood among the snow. The distant ship moved slow against the wind, its sails full but steady. Bright paint along its hull betrayed wealth, or at least better care than their battered Lady Bitter. A merchant, surely. Too fat, too bulky to escape a lean hunter. Ready the cannons. Captain Bartholomew's voice cut through the air. Not loud, never loud, but deep enough to root into bones. His pale eyes studied the distant vessel without blinking. He had fought these hunts before. Hunger drove impatience, but impatience destroyed hunters. One miscalculation, and you chase shadows until your death. The crew worked with clumsy eagerness, rolling cannon from narrow mouths on each side of the ship, stacking iron shot, priming powder horns. These were not the polished weapons of king's navies. They were mismatched, rusted, some lined with cracks that threatened to burst rather than fire. Yet to the starving, even broken teeth can still bite. Wind pressed harder into patched canvas. The bitter end groaned forward, leaning to chase. Salt spray kissed bared faces as speed picked up. From afar, the merchant sails grew clearer. Letters painted on their side, the Providence of London. A cargo ship, sturdy but not built for war. Still it sailed strong. Its crew spotted the predator behind them and began to turn sails, pushing against waves in desperate attempt to flee. But the sea was wide, open, uncluttered. There was no hiding place for prey. Hour by hour, the predator closed. The air on the bitter end vibrated with urgency, hunger, gnawing. Imaginations painting fruit, bread, wine, food so fresh you could almost taste it already melting on the tongue. One man whispered of apples, another muttered of cheese. A third said nothing, simply clenching his jaw until blood tasted of iron. Cannons rolled into position. Muskets were checked, though many failed to spark without careful coaxing. Blades were pulled from sheaths, their edges not gleaming but corroded, speckled with rust where salt had eaten iron. Then, at last, the range closed. "Ready," barked Bartholomew. Muskets lined the deck rails. Cannons hissed with slow matches glowing faint orange. The crew, half starving, quivered like bowstrings. Bartholomew's hand fell. Thunder. Not the thunder of the storm past, but a flat, punishing roar of iron breath. Smoke rolled thick clouds across deck and sea, veiling the sun for seconds. The merchant sails shivered as iron balls tore through canvas. Wooden beams splintered. One mast sprawled sideways, sails dragging into water like a wounded wing. The Providence writhed. Her crew shouted frantically, adjusting lines, trying desperately to limp away, but the predator had bitten. Bleeding sails cannot outrun determined hunger. Closer, closer. Grappling hooks, crude but sharp, were heaved across the gap with wiry arms. Iron teeth clattered against the Providence's rails, biting into her wood. Ropes stiffened, tying predator to prey. And then the collision, a crash like two beasts butting horns. Decks dented, men stumbled. Swords were drawn. Pirates swarmed across the ropes, clambering like spiders in a feeding frenzy. Hunger sharpened them more than courage ever could. They landed on merchant wood with animal snarls, faces stretched thin from weeks of famine, blades slashed. Cries filled the air, some sharp with fear, others dull with grim effort. You, dear dreamer, must not picture this too sharply. Think of it not as clashing steel, but as shadows against moonlight, outlines fumbling in desperation. The truth is not romance, it was chaos. A cook armed with a kitchen knife. A sailor swiping with splinters of broken wood. Pirates clawing at barrels while still fighting off defenders. Within minutes it tilted, numbers pressed downward. The merchant sailors, brave but fewer, gave way. 2 were struck down on the planks, blood pooling dark as inkstorm stains. The rest fell back, gathering by the forecastle. Bartholomew strode forward calm as ever, cutlass sharp in his hand. His voice sliced quieter than fury, colder than rage. Drop arms, surrender your cargo, and live another day to curse us. Resist, and the sea will swallow you. And because they were men of families and fear, the remaining few let weapons fall. Sweat stung their eyes, shoulders slumped heavy. They were beaten not just by swords, but by the endless patience of hunger sharpened. For a moment, silence beat louder than cannons. Then the pirates fell upon the prize. Hatches clanged open. Barrels of wheat were dragged up, rotten around edges yet edible deeper within. Fruits, long stored, rolled out, blemished oranges, soft-skinned lemons. Stomachs cried before mouths even opened. Eliza grabbed one and bit into rind itself, her teeth tearing peel as though it were butter. Juice ran down her chin and she sobbed, not from taste but from relief. Wines were heaved next, red and white, gushing from casks into waiting cups. Biscuits, softer than the weevil-bitten stone they chewed before, crumbled into hungry mouths like miracles, yet gold. Almost nothing. The Providence carried trade, not treasure. Cloth and grain, yes. Barrels, rope, tobacco. But treasure? Only a few small chests of coin for port transaction, hardly enough to buy a lord his boots. Still they feasted like kings of shadows. Greed overcame caution. Men stuffed their cheeks until choking, drank until staggering, laughed too wildly. For the first time in months, stomachs filled with something like plenty. But with plenty, consequences arrived swiftly. The food, half-rotten from long voyage, soured bellies by nightfall. Men vomited across deck rails instead of singing. Some collapsed from feverish shivers, citrus clutched in hands like holy relics. To gorge after famine is to punish the body cruelly, and pirates knew it well, yet could never resist. The merchant crew, bound and bruised, watched with empty faces, their entire livelihood stripped, cargo reduced to scavenged morsels. They would limp back with hull broken, sails torn, honor shattered. And the pirates? They had gained food, some coin, and temporary survival. Not victory, not glory. Only a delay in death's patience. Bartholomew stood apart as always, watching with unreadable gaze. None could tell if his one pale eye mourned or measured. He spoke little, except one sentence to his quartermaster that drifted like frost above laughter. This prize will not last. And so days turned to nights again, bellies half settled but never content. The Providence was looted, stripped, its crew left adrift with crumbs enough to crawl home. The bitter end sailed on, patched wood groaning beneath its new cargo. At first, spirits raised. Pirates sang ragged tunes, voices scratching across starlight. They bellowed songs of false plenty, their verses proud, though full of holes like patched sails. They clinked bottles, laughed with crooked teeth, mocked the merchant's pleas. For a short while the sea seemed tamed, their fate reset, but like all illusions joy thinned. The fresh fruit dwindled quickly, eaten in greedy handfuls. Grain spoiled fast in damp hold, wine turned sour within barrels. And soon enough, hunger crept back, quieter but sharper than before. What had truly changed? Nothing. The storm was behind them, the battle little more than scars and headaches. And yet their daily life resumed. Salt pork, weevil bread, sour water, boredom, scurvy, and the endless hollow searching of horizon after horizon. The merchant raid, which had nearly cost their lives, had bought them only another month of hunger. And so the truth of piracy whispered again into their dreams. You trade one misery for another. You chase, you fight, you bleed, you win, and even victory tastes like ash by nightfall. The days after the raid passed with the peculiar mixture of triumph and hollow ache that defined the pirate's life. At first, laughter still clung to their voices like foam at the edge of waves. They toasted with cracked cups, voices hoarse but loud, as they mocked fortunes and kings alike. The bitter end seemed almost merry for once, like a skeleton briefly dressed in carnival colors. But merriment at sea is short-lived. Salt air eats through joy as surely as it corrodes iron. The fruit that had saved their gums from bleeding was gone within a week. The barrels of grain, though precious, carried worms that multiplied in the damp. The biscuits softened back into mold. Even the wine soured and left throats burning. With so many hard stomachs fed too quickly, more felt ill fever spread, shaking bodies and leaving sweat-soaked hammocks stinking in the dark hold. Better to starve slow, muttered Briggs, his ribs still aching from months past, than to glut and rot this way. Arguments simmered. Who had taken too much orange? Who had drunk deeper than their share of the wine? Who had hidden coins from the chests when dividing spoils? Suspicion is an old friend aboard pirate ships, and now it curled back among them, whispering into every darkened corner. Eliza, though lean and weary, tried to keep her humor light. She sang softly in nights, little tunes that seemed to soothe her own heartbeat even if none else listened. Sometimes she carved scraps of wood into fish or birds, tokens she set carefully on beams between hammocks. Some mocked her, others ignored her, but one or two tucked the carvings inside their belts, as if to carry tenderness secretly, like contraband. Bartholomew alone never faltered. His heavy boots echoed across planks, rhythm steady, that pale eye sweeping like a lighthouse beam. He said little, he asked no comfort, but no sailor dared test him, for the ocean itself seemed stitched into his shoulders. Still, even captains cannot command the sea forever. One evening, under a moon thin as a fisherman's hook, whispers carried across the lower deck. A handful of men bent heads together, cursing Bartholomew's luck, muttering that no treasure had yet come, that even Providence's prize had been a poor reward for such risks. Their whispers bit sharper with each passing night, until even those too afraid to mutter began to nod along in brittle silence. Mutiny quiet, creeping had sprung its seed. But here, dear listener, let us draw a breath. For what is mutiny but hunger with a knife? These men who had endured storms, fevers, battles, and emptiness could barely distinguish rebellion from survival. Their anger was less at the pale-eyed captain than at the cruel horizon that promised nothing but salt and loss. Yet anger always seeks a face, and theirs had found Bartholomew. Above them, the captain already knew. He had seen too many seas to miss such currents in his crew. But instead of fear, a calm certainty sat in his chest. He knew pirates destroy themselves long before kings ever bother firing a cannon. And so the bitter end creaked onward, carrying in its belly both cargo and doubt, both stolen food and festering mistrust. Nothing more fragile than the human chain held it together, and that chain had begun to strain. The sea stretched wide and endless, but aboard the bitter end, the true storm brewed not in clouds above, but in the hearts of men and women below deck. Hunger does not vanish when bellies are filled for a single week. It is like a shadow, always waiting, always creeping back. At first it was whispers. Rumors that Captain Bartholomew held back better food for himself. Murmurs that the fruit had not been divided fairly, that certain sailors' favored ones had been given the lion's share. Every hammock seemed to cradle not sleep but suspicion. They whispered in the dark, words carrying like rats through beams, mutiny. The word itself is simple, but for pirates, it is heavier than any anchor. Mutiny is not rebellion against a king or nation. It is strangling your own blood, biting the very hand that feeds, scratching at the planks that keep you afloat. And yet, starvation dulls reason. Desperation weighs more than loyalty. One night, Jonah, the boy of 14, heard them speaking. He was awake, though pretending to sleep, when Briggs and 2 others leaned close. Their voices blended with the creaks of ropes above. He keeps the coin, mark me. Coin's nothing when bellies starve. Aye, and we're doomed with him holding course to nowhere. Then we take it. Jonah shut his eyes tighter, clenching his fists under thin blanket. He did not want to hear. He did not want to know. But knowledge at sea is never a choice. It clings to you like wet salt. Days pass. Bartholomew, sharp as ever, said nothing. But his pale eyes studied harder, longer. His silence was colder, like a fog drawing tight around shoulders. Arguments grew sharper. One fought over a crust of biscuit, another over a few drops of wine. At dawn one morning, a quarrel ended with knives drawn and blood dripping between planks. The loser lay moaning, shoulder cut deep, and no surgeon aboard to mend him. He survived, but slowly, painfully, another weight dragging down an already heavy ship. Bartholomew let no chaos slide unpunished. He ordered lashes. The quartermaster's whip cracked, biting into backs and shoulders, each strike echoing like a cannon. Men clenched teeth, women clenched fists, and the boy Jonah hid his face. But the punishment was given, and though bodies trembled, none dared cry out. Pirates do not weep for justice, and each knew they could be next. Still, the muttering continued. Madness of monotony filled the hours. They scraped barnacles from hull with knives, singing half-tunes without melody. They played dice with bones carved from rats. They smoked tobacco that burned their throats harsh. Anything to keep from thinking of the endless sea. And then came the theft. One morning, a barrel of grain was found split-chewed open in the night. Mouths gaped in disbelief. The food was already scarce, rationed carefully. Now half of it gone. Bartholomew stalked the deck with steps slow and dreadful. His shoulders looked carved from stone, his cutlass swinging at his hip like judgment itself. Which one of you? His voice rumbled low. Thieves from the crew itself? His eyes swept the trembling faces. Silence rang louder than gulls above. He turned the silence over like a stone, letting it weigh on them, until Eliza lifted her thin chin and whispered, "It was Briggs." The crew froze. Briggs' own mouth opened to spit curses, but fear twisted his voice. His arms twitched toward a blade, instinctive, and at once 3 others pounced, pinning him. Bartholomew ordered him tied to the mast, and before noon's sun was overhead, punishment was decided not by law, for pirates scorn law, but by hunger. They marooned him. At the next nameless island, a strip of sand with little but palms and gulls, Briggs was rowed ashore. His cutlass was taken, his pistol fired empty, his share of food reduced to crumbs. He was left standing on the beach, cursing with face red, until their ship's sails carried them beyond his voice. Perhaps he survived some weeks, perhaps he did not. Few ever returned from marooning. His absence left silence thicker than fog. If anyone still whispered mutiny, they dared not louder. Survival had reclaimed its throne, and fear was its crown. And yet fear cannot erase hunger. The Biscayne winds grew harsher that month. Gulls wheeled overhead, reminding men of dinners long gone. Night storms drenched hammocks and turned sleep into shivers. And again the whispers returned, softer this time, but more venomous like snakes instead of wolves. Jonah, clutching his blanket each night, closed his eyes tighter and wished for crickets and grass. The sea gave him only shadows and the sound of teeth grinding as men dreamed of bread. The tide of unrest could not be stopped. Briggs was gone, but seeds of discontent had already sunk roots too deep. Every disappointment watered them. Every rotting biscuit, every spoiled cask, every horizon bare of prey. Then came the small betrayal that set sparks into tinder. One dusky evening, a sailor named Harker was found hiding coins in his boot. Not many, just 3 or 4 small silvers, but hoarding coin is poison to pirates. For if one begins to steal from the collective plunder, trust rots. And with trust gone, pirates are worse off than prisoners. Bartholomew had him dragged before the crew. The captain's face, though steady, bore more wear than weeks earlier. Hunger, suspicion, lashings they carved into even him. "What worth has silver?" Bartholomew asked, voice low, "when food is scarce, when bellies cry louder than purses?" "You shame your mates," the crew muttered. Some agreed. Some spat curses at Harker. Others, though, felt the sting of hypocrisy. Because was not their life already envy and greed? Was not every man aboard cursed with wishing for more than he was given? Yet they could not challenge Bartholomew's word directly. Not yet. Harker was given the sweat, forced to run the deck between rows of crew, beaten by each with ropes or sticks. He staggered, collapsed, rose, collapsed again. Each strike cracked both flesh and morale. By the end, he lay half dead, his boot emptied of silver, his eyes glazed. That night, Eliza sang no tunes. Jonah wept softly in his hammock, though none dared call him boy for it. And the crew lay silent, chewing thin bread with toothless gums, bitterness soaking deeper than salt water. The next morning, more fighting. A spark at breakfast. One accused another of stealing his ration. A shove, a knife, blood dripping into salted pork. Had Bartholomew not intervened, half the ship might have torn itself apart. The captain's hand struck harder than any lash. He slammed his cutlass down onto the table, splitting wood, his pale eye burning. "Keep your steel for prey," he growled, "or else I feed you to the sea myself." For a moment, silence returned. For a moment, they feared him more than hunger, but fear is not forever. Fear keeps men alive only so long before rage hunts it down. By nightfall, mutiny spilled again, this time with knives glinting. 5 men cornered the quartermaster, claiming injustices, claiming more coin had been hidden, claiming too much flesh was given to punishment. They screamed curses, spit flying across the damp wood. The quartermaster drew steel, and before the moon had risen high, 2 lay dead on the deck, one gasping in his own blood. The others fled, their voices rising into the night, shrieking for freedom, for vengeance. They cried that Bartholomew was a tyrant, curse captain of curses, leading them forever to hunger and never to gold. The ship split that night, not into halves of timber, but halves of loyalty. Some clung to Bartholomew, fearful or respectful. Others drifted to whispers of rebellion, preferring any change over none. And in that divide was carved the real truth. Pirate life was never strength, never unity. Pirate life was knives against each other, always. Jonah, watching with wide eyes from shadows, realized he had never been afraid of storms. Not really. He feared lightning, yes, but storms passed. Men, though, men carried storms forever. For another week, the ship carried both factions under one set of sails. An uneasy truce born only because the sea itself threatened worse than any quarrel. But at night, the mutinous sharpened knives silently. At dawn, Bartholomew's men kept eyes sharp on them. The air itself aboard was tense. To sleep was to risk waking with a blade to your throat. To eat was to fear poison. To pray was to wonder whether heaven heard men of such lives at all. The sea, vast and still indifferent, said nothing. It rocked them gently like a cradle, as men plan murder over its lullabies. And thus, Section 3 drifts closed hunger in bellies and hatred in hearts. Blade points turned not outward, but inward. The sea lay deceptively calm, its waters smooth and glinting under the faint lantern light of the half-moon. Outwardly all was peace, but peace was the last thing alive in the timbers of the bitter end. Hunger had peeled away the last scraps of patience. Men whose arms had once joined in hauling sails now clutched their knives under blankets when no one watched. Women too lean to laugh stared silently across the gloom, their eyes like sharpened glass daring others to steal a morsel. Even young Jonah, cradled in his hammock, noticed how footsteps creaked differently at night, no longer with the rhythm of work, but the twitching hesitation of suspicion. Whispers had swollen for days, seeping into every conversation like seawater creeping through split boards. Mutiny. At first they were only sighs. He hoards the coin. He lets us starve. Better him gone than all of us robbed for his pride. At first harmless enough, a way to spit bitterness into the dark. But hunger gave those words claws, and once the first claw pierced, the mutiny would not rest until it became fangs. It began with a musket crack. Jonah jolted awake, heart battering his ribs. Boots thundered above deck, and voices clashed at once, curses flung louder than gulls. The sound of steel followed, bright and merciless, blade against blade. Smoke seeped into the hold, making hammocks sway in restless air. Around him other sailors woke too, but none dared climb up into that storm. They knew. The whispers had woke him. The quartermaster fell first. He had been Bartholomew's shadow, executing punishments, handing out rations, tightening discipline. If Bartholomew was the mast, the quartermaster was its rope, and so they cut the rope. Pirates pounced on him with fury, sharpened by hunger, their fists and knives tearing him down before he could raise his pistol. They dragged him, bleeding and roaring curses, and lashed him against the mast as though nailing their fear like a trophy. And then the captain came. Bartholomew emerged from his cabin, coat unbuttoned, cutlass already lifted. He had never needed to shout to command attention. Even now, with smoke-stinging nostrils and chaos writhing around him, his presence poured across the blood-streaked deck like a black tide. His pale eyes shone as though carved from storm glass, frightening in its stillness. "Lay down your arms," he said, his voice heavy but calm, "or you'll lie down in your graves." For a breath, chaos faltered. Men gripped hilts tightly but hesitated. Years of fearing him settled into their bodies by habit. Dread rooted their boots to the planks. Then one mutineer spat. "He starves us." Another spat louder. "He hoards gold while our guts rot." A musket ball slammed into the deck, scattering splinters by the captain's boots, and that was the end of hesitation. Bartholomew moved like a man sculpted from iron that had finally been hammered into motion. His cutlass whistled arcs of pale light, cutting the nearest pirate across collarbone. He pivoted and drove his pistol's butt into another's mouth, sending teeth scattered like broken shells. His stride carried a dreadful rhythm, every step ending in a wound. Jonah watched from shadows, awe boiling with fear in his chest. The captain was no man then, but a force, his eye unblinking, each strike deliberate as though the sea itself had armed him. But numbers drown even stone. They surged, yelling curses not from bravery but fear, their bodies pressed together for courage. Two seized him from behind. Another swung an oar across his back, forcing him to stumble. Ropes shot forward and looped his arm, then his throat. Still he bellowed not, only growled like the groan of timbers splitting in storm. The fight lasted long enough for the deck to slick heavy with blood and sweat, but at last his cutlass dropped from his hand. The clang as it struck the boards sounded to Jonah like the bell that marked the death of order. They cheered, but their voices were cracked, for even in ropes, Bartholomew's face did not yield. Bound tight to the mast, bruised and crimson, he looked at them the way cliffs look at the sea, enduring, unbending, unmoved. Dawn came. The sky blushed pale red, bleeding into clouds. The rebels dragged their captain from mast to dinghy. His hair was matted, his cheeks streaked with blood, yet he walked without faltering. They gave him a single skin of water, rope still on his arms, and shoved him into the small boat as though casting away an old anchor. Harker, the man who had once hidden silver in his boot, now strutted on the deck like a rooster. "Let him rot," he declared, voice loud though trembling. "He starved us, lashed us, cursed us. Now the sea will chew his bones instead." None truly cheered, but none stopped it. The dinghy drifted. Bartholomew sat upright, jaw raised, pale eyes staring at the horizon. He did not turn back. He did not curse them. He remained as he had always been, silent, steady, terrifying. Even small as a pinprick against the reef, he seemed too large to be abandoned. Jonah gripped the railing until splinters bit his palms. In the boy's chest, something fractured. Not loyalty, not rebellion, but the certainty that nothing steady remained. When the horizon swallowed the dinghy, the bitter end was rudderless in more ways than one. The mutineers cheered half-heartedly, swaggering among themselves, clapping one another on hollow backs. They strutted as though freedom had been won, but freedom bought on betrayal is fragile. The sea lay calm again, whispering beneath them as if amused. It knew better. It always did. And the bitter end sailed on, her mast standing, her sails patched, but her heart abandoned onto those rocks where her captain had been left. The deck of the bitter end had not known true silence since the mutiny, but after the dinghy vanished and Captain Bartholomew became only a dark memory on the reefs, the quiet seemed heavier. It was not the comfortable hush of calm seas. It was a tense, suffocating stillness, like the breath held too long inside a chest about to burst. The mutineers claimed their victory with uneasy laughter. Harker, who had struck the captain and bound his wrists, rose to the quarterdeck as though it had always been his place. He thrust out his chest. He barked orders. He promised better rations, better shares, a better fate now that the tyrant had been thrown to the waves. But there was no gold, no treasure, no feast waiting. There was only the same salt wind, the same rotting grain, the same cracked casks of slimy water. Harker bellowed his promises anyway, and the crew tried to cheer, but their cheers sounded brittle, like wood about to splinter. Jonah stood near the rail, silent. He did not know whom to follow now. He had looked to the captain with fear, but also certainty. Now there was no certainty left, only suspicion and a hollow ache in his stomach. The days that followed blurred into sickness. The food dwindled faster than they pretended. Barrels of grain, already damp, festered into mold. Men picked out the black parts with fingers and pretended what remained was safe. Water ran low and grew ranker with each gulp. Those who drank enough to slake their thirst felt their bodies rebel with fever. Eliza tried to sing in the evenings, the voice that had once lightened hearts after storms, but even her songs were faint now, thin and wavering, as if her lungs themselves were too weary to hold melody. The ship lost its discipline. The sails were patched haphazardly. The deck was left sticky and unwashed. Dice games turned to brawls. Some kept knives at their sides even while they slept. And more than once Jonah heard the hiss of steel at midnight and the thump of bodies dragged to the sea without ceremony. Men who called Harker captain in the daylight muttered curses behind his back by night. His voice was sharp but not steady. He ordered but was not followed. He promised but delivered nothing. Where Bartholomew had held the crew by fear anchored deep, Harker held them only by fear strung thin, which snaps too easily. And then the horizon gave them no friend, but a predator. It began as a speck of dark in the pale line where sea met sky. Some thought it a trick of mist. But as hours passed and sails filled, the shape became clear, a naval vessel, broad and orderly, sails white, banners bright with the sigil of the crown. Not a merchant ripe for plunder, but a warship built to hunt. Panic skittered through the bitter end like rats. Some argued to fight. They raised muskets, slapped powder into pans, sharpened old cutlasses. Others shouted to run, though their patched sails were no match for canvas fresh and wide. A third group spoke in broken voices of surrender. Better the rope, they said, than thirst and fever. But the decision was not theirs to vote. At the quarterdeck, Harker strutted, shouting all commands at once. Raise sails, arm the cannons, ready the wine barrels, throw the sick overboard, fire, curse you, fire. His rage tumbled over itself, his arms flailing wide as ships closed distance. By the next dawn, the horizon brimmed with war. The naval ship loomed starboard, bristling with cannons fresh and polished. They barked thunder that shook the heavens. Iron balls tore splinters waist deep from the bitter end's hull. The screams of the wounded joined the screams of the wood itself, and neither sounded human anymore. The pirates tried to answer with their own cannons, but half misfired, coughing smoke and powder without iron. A few balls clanged harmlessly into the sea. Others slammed, but did no real wound to the stronger vessel. Muskets cracked and snapped, led whistling into void. Then another ball struck true, opening a mouth in the ship's side large enough for seawater to pour. The bitter end groaned, staggered, tilted underfoot. Buckets clanged as men tried to bail. Others dropped them instantly to clutch rope or blade. Fear drove them in all directions, no longer crew at all, but a scatter of desperate bodies clawing for escape. Some leapt over the rails at once, their arms beating the surface of the water, as though the ocean itself might be kinder than the cannons. Jonah held the mast, his heart hammering as if it might break his ribs. The deck listed further. His small frame slipped, scrambling, gripping again. All about him was chaos, smoke thick, eyes wild, breath rattled with the certainty of death. The last blow came mid-morning. A naval ball ripped into the heart of the ship, deep where timbers already wept. The deck lurched as though pulled downward by invisible chains. Wood shrieked, ropes swung madly, and then she split, groaning one long and final note, the death cry of a ship that had carried hunger, storms, lashings, and betrayal, yet could carry no more. The bitter end collapsed into herself. Her stern lifted, bow sinking. Sails snapped straight up like pale hands begging to the sky. Then water swallowed the mast, swallowed the sails, swallowed the men screaming upon them. Jonah was flung to sea, clutching a broken beam. Around him, men thrashed, cursed, cried. Some vanished instantly, some floated, some begged heaven in languages that melted into the roar of waves. Above, the warship sailed calmly on, its cannon silent now, its victory final. It did not bother with survivors. Whether dragged aboard in chains or left as foam in the water mattered little to Navy men. Pirates were all the same, disposable warnings to others. Jonah floated, clinging to his beam until his arms numbed. He could not see Eliza anymore. He could not hear Harker's shrill commands. The sea rinsed all names, all faces, all grievances into one vast, endless rhythm. And so the boy who had never truly been pirate, but only a boy lost at sea, gazed up at the white sky and whispered not for treasure, nor food, nor command, only for grass, for the sound of crickets, for the small dirt baked worm and sun. He whispered until his lips cracked and his voice faded. What became of him the ocean does not tell. It never tells of those it swallows. It keeps their stories as part of its tide, repeating them only through whispers that brush against sleepers' ears when the night is especially quiet. And maybe, my dear dreamer, you've heard those whispers tonight. Here's the truth they carry. The life of pirates was never a song, never glory, never gold. It was long thirst, sharp betrayal, cruel storms, sickness, and at the end, silence. Even mutiny did not save them. Even freedom strangled itself. The bitter end sank without coin enough to buy bread, without food enough to last a fortnight, without friends enough to bury their own. And now, in your own soft bed, you may at last release the weight of their story. Feel how your pillow is steadier than any plank, how your blanket is warmer than any ragged coat, how your breath is freer than any sailor's gasps among rotten barrels. Rest gently, drift easily, know that you are safe. Where pirates drowned, you will dream. The true treasure waits here, not across the sea, not in gold, but in peace, in comfort, in sleep. And the tide of night carries you there now. The deck of the bitter end had not known true silence since the mutiny, but after the dinghy vanished and Captain Bartholomew became only a dark memory on the reefs, the quiet seemed heavier. It was not the comfortable hush of calm seas. It was a tense, suffocating stillness, like the breath held too long inside a chest about to burst. The mutineers claimed their victory with uneasy laughter. Harker, who had struck the captain and bound his wrists, rose to the quarterdeck as though it had always been his place. He thrust out his chest. He barked orders. He promised better rations, better shares, a better fate now that the tyrant had been thrown to the waves. But there was no gold, no treasure, no feast waiting. There was only the same salt wind, the same rotting grain, the same cracked casks of slimy water. Harker bellowed his promises anyway, and the crew tried to cheer, but their cheers sounded brittle, like wood about to splinter. Jonah stood near the rail, silent. He did not know whom to follow now. He had looked to the captain with fear, but also certainty. Now there was no certainty left, only suspicion and a hollow ache in his stomach. The days that followed blurred into sickness. The food dwindled faster than they pretended. Barrels of grain, already damp, festered into mold. Men picked out the black parts with fingers and pretended what remained was safe. Water ran low and grew ranker with each gulp. Those who drank enough to slake their thirst felt their bodies rebel with fever. Eliza tried to sing in the evenings, the voice that had once lightened hearts after storms, but even her songs were faint now, thin and wavering, as if her lungs themselves were too weary to hold melody. The ship lost its discipline. The sails were patched haphazardly. The deck was left sticky and unwashed. Dice games turned to brawls. Some kept knives at their sides even while they slept, and more than once Jonah heard the hiss of steel at midnight and the thump of bodies dragged to the sea without ceremony. Men who called Harker captain in the daylight muttered curses behind his back by night. His voice was sharp, but not steady. He ordered, but was not followed. He promised, but delivered nothing. Where Bartholomew had held the crew by fear anchored deep, Harker held them only by fear strung thin, which snaps too easily. And then the horizon gave them no friend, but a predator. It began as a speck of dark in the pale line where sea met sky. Some thought it a trick of mist. But as hours passed and sails filled, the shape became clear, a naval vessel, broad and orderly, sails white, banners bright with the sigil of the crown. Not a merchant ripe for plunder, but a warship built to hunt. Panic skittered through the bitter end like rats. Some argued to fight. They raised muskets, slapped powder into pans, sharpened old cutlasses. Others shouted to run, though their patched sails were no match for canvas fresh and wide. A third group spoke in broken voices of surrender. Better the rope, they said, than thirst and fever. But the decision was not theirs to vote. At the quarterdeck, Harker strutted, shouting all commands at once. Raise sails, arm the cannons, ready the wine barrels, throw the sick overboard, fire, curse you, fire. His rage tumbled over itself, his arms flailing wide as ships closed distance. By the next dawn, the horizon brimmed with war. The naval ship loomed starboard, bristling with cannons fresh and polished. They barked thunder that shook the heavens. Iron balls tore splinters waist deep from the bitter end's hull. The screams of the wounded joined the screams of the wood itself, and neither sounded human anymore. The pirates tried to answer with their own cannons, but half misfired, coughing smoke and powder without iron. A few balls clanged harmlessly into the sea. Others slammed, but did no real wound to the stronger vessel. Muskets cracked and snapped, led whistling into void. Then another ball struck true, opening a mouth in the ship's side large enough for seawater to pour. The bitter end groaned, staggered, tilted underfoot. Buckets clanged as men tried to bail. Others dropped them instantly to clutch rope or blade. Fear drove them in all directions, no longer crew at all, but a scatter of desperate bodies clawing for escape. Some leapt over the rails at once, their arms beating the surface of the water, as though the ocean itself might be kinder than the cannons. Jonah held the mast, his heart hammering as if it might break his ribs. The deck listed further. His small frame slipped, scrambling, gripping again. All about him was chaos, smoke thick, eyes wild, breath rattled with the certainty of death. The last blow came mid-morning. A naval ball ripped into the heart of the ship, deep where timbers already wept. The deck lurched as though pulled downward by invisible chains. Wood shrieked, rope swung madly, and then she split, groaning one long and final note, the death cry of a ship that had carried hunger, storms, lashings, and betrayal, yet could carry no more. The bitter end collapsed into herself. Her stern lifted, though sinking. Sails snapped straight up like pale hands begging to the sky. Then water swallowed the mast, swallowed the sails, swallowed the men screaming upon them. Jonah was flung to sea, clutching a broken beam. Around him, men thrashed, cursed, cried. Some vanished instantly, some floated, some begged heaven in languages that melted into the roar of waves. Above, The warship sailed calmly on, its cannon silent now, its victory final. It did not bother with survivors. Whether dragged aboard in chains or left as foam in the water mattered little to Navy men. Pirates were all the same, disposable warnings to others. Jonah floated, clinging to his beam until his arms numbed. He could not see Eliza anymore. He could not hear Harker's shrill commands. The sea rinsed all names, all faces, all grievances into one vast, endless rhythm. And so the boy who had never truly been pirate, but only a boy lost at sea, gazed up at the white sky and whispered not for treasure, nor food, nor command, only for grass, for the sound of crickets, for the small dirt baked warm in sun. He whispered until his lips cracked and his voice faded. What became of him the ocean does not tell. It never tells of those it swallows. It keeps their stories as part of its tide, repeating them only through whispers that brush against sleepers' ears when the night is especially quiet. And maybe, my dear dreamer, you've heard those whispers tonight. Here's the truth they carry. The life of pirates was never a song, never glory, never gold. It was long thirst, sharp betrayal, cruel storms, sickness, and at the end, silence. Even mutiny did not save them. Even freedom strangled itself. The bitter end sank without coin enough to buy bread, without food enough to last a fortnight, without friends enough to bury their own. And now, in your own soft bed, you may at last release the weight of their story. Feel how your pillow is steadier than any plank, how your blanket is warmer than any ragged coat, how your breath is freer than any sailor's gasps among rotten barrels. Rest gently, drift easily, know that you are safe. Where pirates drowned, you will dream. The true treasure waits here, not across the sea, not in gold, but in peace, in comfort, in sleep. And the tide of night carries you there now,